In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the fuel injectors on this Toyota 4Runner. Let's get into it. Underneath the vehicle, we're going to take this shield down using a 13mm socket. Take the bolts out. There's two in the front. I'm going to slide the front part back and try to slide it down. There's a couple clips holding it in. And then the back part is going to slide forward. Right here, there is a drain on the radiator. If your radiator doesn't have a drain right there, you want to pop off the coolant hose. Make sure you have a drain bucket underneath. Just loosen up this drain. And just drain the coolant out. We're going to disconnect the battery, the negative terminal. Use a 10mm wrench. Loosen up the nut. And slide it off and out of the way. Disconnect the mass airflow sensor. There's just a little push tab. Just push that down. Slide the connector off. Just pop this retainer off right here. You can use some needle nose pliers. Just squeeze the tabs. That slides off, out of the way. There's another retainer right here. This one's broken. Just pull that aside as well. Then over here, there's a retainer. And pop that off. Pop this hose out of the bracket right there. There's another hose right here. Just use some hose pliers. Just slide this off, just like that, out of the way. There's a hose up top. You can use some hose pliers. Just wiggle that back and forth. Slide that off. Set that aside. Using a 10mm socket, we're going to loosen up the worm clamps. That one there, and right here. Just grab the snorkel, slide it off the throttle body, and slide it off the mass airflow sensor. I'll just grab this hose. I'm just using some hose pliers. Just twist it, and it slides right off. Disconnect the connector right here. Just push down on the tab. Slide the connector off. There's another connector over here. Push down on the tab and slide it off. Going to use some pliers just to squeeze that, slide that off. There's a connector down below here. Push down on the tab and slide that one off. Take this hose off right here, just slide it down. If you need to, you can use pliers. Push that out of the way. All right, this hose right here, I'm just going to pull this out of this bracket. You might have to bend the bracket just slightly. Slide that out. We have the cable that goes to the throttle body. Slide that out of the bracket. And there's a bracket right here. We want to take that bolt out. Using a 14mm socket. Now slide the cable off. Slide the end out. And set that aside. I'm going to take this hose off. I'm just going to use some hose clamp pliers. Squeeze that. And using some hose pliers, twist this back and forth and slide it off. Now we're going to take this bracket off that's connected to this line right here. That's the throttle cable line. Use a 10mm socket. Loosen that up. Take that bolt out right there, and then that can be set aside. Take this ground wire right here off. We're going to use a 10mm socket. Loosen that up. Take that off. We're going to pop this diagnostic connector off. I'm just going to use a pick, and there's a little tab in there. Slide back on that tab, and that slides up. That's the tab right there. Just set that aside. This hose that runs along the back, just pop that out of the bracket. Set that aside. Now we're going to loosen up the bolts and nuts for the intake manifold. We'll start over here using a 12mm socket. Just crack them free first. That's all of them. Grab the manifold. I'm just going to tip it up, and over here, there is a hose for the PCV. Just pop that off. You can twist this out of the way so I don't have to disconnect the coolant hoses that go to the throttle body. Take this gasket off, just slide it off. You don't want to drop anything in there, so be careful. To prevent anything from falling in there, I'm just going to take some rags. I'll stuff it in there. You just need to remember to remove the rags before we put this back together. I'm going to clean up this gasket material. You can use a scraper or a razor blade, just be careful. Try to scrape away from the center where the holes are. And just take a rag and some brake parts cleaner and just clean this up a little bit. This hose right here and tube, we're going to take that off. Use a 12mm socket. Take the two bolts off for the brackets. Just going to use a 12mm wrench. Loosen this one up. You can take it out by hand. Grab the hose, just slide it to the side. In the back there's a bracket that's connected to the lower intake. Use a 10mm wrench, loosen that up. Take that off, that's separated. Underneath there's a hose that's attached to a bracket. You got to take those two bolts out. You're going to use a 10mm socket. Just move some of the other hoses out of the way. Alright, those are off. Now take this bolt off. Use a 12mm socket. Loosen that up. Alright, and that bracket's separated. There's some bolts we're going to take out on this side of the intake. Use a 12mm socket. There's a nut on the side here. Loosen that up. I'll just loosen them all first. Take the nut off. Grab the intake. Slide it up. And it slides right up. On the bottom of the throttle body, we're going to take these two hoses off. Just use some hose clamp pliers. Slide the clamps down. I'm just using some hose pliers. Loosen these up. You can use regular pliers, just be careful not to squeeze it too much. Slide those off. And slide that off. Now just grab this upper intake and pull it out of the way. I'm just gonna plug up the holes with some rags so nothing falls down in there. This wiring harness right here, we're gonna have to take the 2 bolts out on the sides. There's one on this side, one on the other side. Use a 10mm socket, remove that bolt. The harness is clipped in underneath this cover. You're gonna have to feel for a little clip. Release that clip and you can slide the harness out of the way. There's a clip on the back side here as well. Slide that out so that you can move the harness a little bit. There is a coolant temp sensor on the back. Just squeeze that sensor. Try to slide that out just to give you some more room. You can get all the injector connectors disconnected. Just push down on the tab. Slide these out. Do the same on the other side. There's a connector right here. You want to disconnect this connector. Just push down on the tab. That's disconnected. I'm going to take these bolts out. There's 4 bolts holding that on. Use a 12mm socket. Those out. Now grab the rail, just give it a wiggle, slide it up. Just using the pry bar, just prying up on this. At this point, you don't have to pull the fuel rail out anymore. You can just slide the injector off. You're gonna lose some fuel. You might want to put some rags. Be careful, if there's any pressure in there, you're gonna spray yourself. Put a rag underneath and just slide that down and the injector comes right out. Take the new injector, you can put a little dielectric grease on the O-rings, pull the rag out of the way, take the injector, slide it into the rail first. And then before you put this whole rail back in, you want to do the same on the other injectors. Once they're all replaced, line the injectors up. Give it a wiggle and push them down in place. Do the same on the back side. And now we can put the bolts back in. Put the bolts in. Snug these down. Now torque these to 71 inch-pounds. Just going to use a little compressed air. And just take a rag with some brake parts cleaner and just wipe it down. That's good. At this point, I'll take these rags out. Just make sure no debris falls in there. Just take some compressed air. That's good. Take the gasket, line it up. slide it in position. Now I'm going to take a scraper or a razor blade and just clean up the gasket material on this middle intake. And take a rag, the little brake parts cleaner, and just wipe off any debris. That's good. And then you can do the same on the other side. We're going to do the same with the upper. Just scrape the gasket material off. And clean it up. Now take the intake, make sure some of the hoses are out of the way. Line these up, make sure it's lined up on the studs. Make sure all your hoses are at least going in the right direction. Now we can put the bolts back in. Now snug these down. And torque those bolts to 13 foot-pounds. Now this bracket underneath here, we'll attach that, put the 2 bolts in. Tighten that down. Snug. Same with the other bolt. Now we can slide this connector right here, and this ground strap is going to go right here. Get that started and snug that down. And put the bolt in this bracket. Get that started. Take the back bolt, slide it through where the wiring harness goes on the back side here. Get that started. Snug that down. Now these 2 bolts for the bracket. Tighten those down. Take the rags out of here. Just make sure no debris falls in there. Put the gasket on. There should be a stud on this one. Put the stud in there. That's good. Take the upper intake. Line this up. The studs are going to go right there. Line the hoses up. That's for the PCV. And then the coolant hoses. If you took those off, you would put those back on. Good. Get the bolts in. And the 2 nuts on the studs. Yep, snug those down. torque these to 13 foot-pounds. Slide this hose over here. Use the hose pliers, move that down. Take this bracket, line that up, and put the bolt in. Tighten that down. And slide this into the bracket right here. That's the throttle cable. Goes right there. Take the cable, slide it in position. Push it in. And get that lined up. Line the bracket up. Put the bolt in. Tighten that down. Connect the connectors. This hose, slide this hose right on here. The other connector, lock that in place. There's a connector down here. Plug that in. Take the snorkel, line it up. That's good. There's a hose up here. I'm going to line that up. Push that on. Make sure it's in the bracket. There's a hose right here. Slide that tube on. Tighten down the worm clamps. This hose right here, it's going to go right there. Connector, line the connector up. Plug it in. If this retainer was in somewhere, you want to plug that back in. Right there. This should go right here. And it goes right there. Now connect the negative terminal and tighten it down. And snug it up. We'll put the drain plug for the radiator back in. And snug that down. Now take the shield, slide it in the middle, in the back. It's got a clip on there. Clip it on the front. Right there. Get the bolt started. And put the other two bolts in. And snug these all down. Now we're going to add the coolant. Take the radiator cap off, just twist to the left, slide that off. Now we're going to use a funnel to add the coolant. You don't have to use a funnel, but it helps. Now we're going to add the appropriate coolant, a 50-50 mix. After it's all full, you can take the funnel off, put the cap on. Make sure the reservoir has plenty of coolant in it, and run the vehicle for about 15 to 20 minutes, constantly monitoring, make sure the engine is not overheating. After that, shut it down, let it cool, and double check your level.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.